In the archive located at Holy Office Street number 11, behind massive walls adjoining St. Peter's Basilica, there is stored a document that has become the starting point for understanding the modern system of ideological control of the Catholic Church. This is the minutes of the meeting from December 7, 1965, signed by Pope Paul VI. At first glance, it appears to be an act of liberalization. The infamous Index of Forbidden Books is abolished, and the Sacred Congregation of the Holy Office is renamed the Sacred Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. However, paleographic analysis of the text and its comparison with subsequent administrative practice indicate not the elimination of the repressive apparatus, but its deep technical modernization. The archaeology of power requires us to look not at the change of signs, but at the preservation of jurisdictional continuities. Instead of public acts of physical suppression characteristic of the early modern period, the structure has transitioned to methods of administrative elimination of subjectivity and censorship embedded in the legal system of the Vatican State. Before we proceed to a detailed analysis of the mechanisms of operation of this oldest, currently active special service in the world, I ask you to subscribe to our channel. Your support allows us to continue the painstaking work with primary sources, avoiding superficial speculations and restoring the true history of institutions of power. To understand the nature of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, it is necessary to reconstruct the political anatomy of the Catholic Church in the mid-20th century. After the Second Vatican Council, the institution faced a systemic crisis. The blurring of dogmatic boundaries threatened the integrity of the corporate hierarchy. In these conditions, the congregation became a key node of management, a kind of analytical center, and at the same time, a tribunal, whose task was to filter incoming information and block destructive ideologies from the center's point of view. The social composition of the structure in this period was the higher clergy, who received legal education in Roman universities, and a narrow circle of expert consultants whose names often did not appear in open reports. This was the power of experts, hidden behind theological terminology, but operating with rigid categories of law. The mechanics of the congregation's work in the era of its highest influence, which coincided with the period of leadership by Joseph Ratzinger, represented a well-oiled bureaucratic conveyor. The process, called ratio agendi, order of actions, began with monitoring publications. According to financial reports and the staffing schedule, the congregation had dozens of delegates in various regions of the world who performed the functions of informants. As soon as the text of one or another theologian was recognized as potentially dangerous, the procedure of ordinary investigation was launched. Here we see the triumph of logistics. The case was passed to the ponens, the rapporteur, who prepared a summary dossier. All orders and internal memoranda were transmitted through secure communication channels within the Vatican, and personal meetings of consultants took place on a clear schedule. On Wednesdays, Feria Quarta, which is a direct continuity with the routine of the 16th century Inquisition. The oaths sworn by employees of the congregation included a clause on adherence to the papal secret. This was not a mystical obligation, but a legal instrument, the violation of which entailed immediate termination of the individual's existence as part of the church structure, automatic excommunication. In this context, the papal secret functions as the highest form of corporate non-disclosure agreement, ensuring the system's airtightness. Descriptions of specific meeting locations, austere halls in the Palace of the Holy Office with their heavy wooden tables and absence of electronic recording devices, emphasize the drive for complete isolation of information flows. Information was transmitted primarily in Latin, serving as an additional filter that screened out the uninitiated and ensured unambiguous interpretations unavailable to living, evolving national languages. Our investigation warrants particular attention to the figure of Joseph Ratzinger, who headed the structure on November 25, 1981. His nickname, God's Rottweiler, though a journalistic cliché, accurately reflects the institutional role he performed. Ratzinger transformed the congregation into an effective instrument for suppressing liberation theology in Latin America. Analysis of diplomatic correspondence from that era reveals that the congregation's activities were closely synchronized with the political interests of major state players, who feared the spread of Marxist ideas under the guise of religion. In the 1984 document titled Instruction on Certain Aspects of the Theology of Liberation, Ratzinger employs a method of semantic dismantling. He does not merely prohibit the doctrine, he strips it of its terminological apparatus, declaring key concepts heretical. This was an operation of intellectual elimination of competitors without resorting to pyres, but with comparable results for their academic careers. Recruitment into the ranks of the congregation's consultants proceeded on the principle of personal loyalty and verified qualifications in canon law. This was not a secret society in the classical sense, but a closed intellectual caste. The encryption system during this period evolved from simple substitutions to complex protocols for document classification. Sub secreto pontificio, under papal secret. Errors in logistics that could lead to leaks were minimized by the fact that all key decisions were made within the ordinary congregation, where the circle of participants was extremely narrowed. Failures, if they occurred, stemmed not from technical glitches, but from the human factor, betrayal by trusted individuals, as happened in the much later Vatican leaks affair. However, during the 1980s and 1990s, the system demonstrated exemplary resilience. Critical auditing of sources concerning the congregation's activities compels us to approach interrogation protocols and official condemnation acts with caution. After the archives of the Holy Office, up to 1903, were opened to researchers in 1998, it became clear that the testimonies of many witnesses and the accused themselves in past centuries resulted not only from physical coercion, but from a complex system of psychological pressure and legal traps. In the modern period, the situation has changed only formally. Instead of the rack, mechanisms of license revocation for teaching, missio canonica, are used. According to the report on the Leonardo Boff case in 1985, he was imposed with obligatory silence. This is a form of administrative elimination of an individual's voice from the public sphere, which in the Church's legal field is equivalent to civil death. Contradictions in witness testimonies in modern cases often arise because the accused theologians are forced to sign confessions under the threat of the cessation of their community's existence or the deprivation of financial support for their institutions. Analysis of the oath and pledge system in the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith reveals a rigid hierarchical vertical. The oath upon assuming office, professio fide and usurandum fidelitatis, implies complete submission to the Pope's will and adherence to doctrinal discipline. There is no mysticism in this. It is a standard loyalty contract reinforced by religious sanction. The system of transmitting orders from the prefect to subordinate levels functioned like clockwork. Every directive was recorded in the outgoing correspondence journal with the assignment of a unique protocol number. These numbers, which we see on forms stamped by the congregation, allow reconstructing the chronology of suppressing any heretical movement with precision down to the hour. Examining the logistics of the conspirators' meetings, if we can call that way those who tried to reform the church from within, bypassing the official doctrine, the congregation used counterintelligence methods. Meetings of dissident theologians were recorded, their correspondence intercepted through local episcopal chancelleries. This was a total monitoring system where the role of censor was performed not by one person, but by the entire management apparatus. The financial flows of the structure, according to Vatican budget summaries, were directed not only to maintaining the apparatus, but also to publishing counter-propaganda materials, which testifies to an understanding of the importance of information warfare. The critical failure of the control system in a number of cases was linked to an overestimation of the possibilities of administrative pressure. For example, in the case of the "We Are Church" movement in Europe, the congregation encountered a network structure that could not be suppressed by targeted elimination of leaders. The logistical error lay in attempting to apply methods of a centralized tribunal to a decentralized information network. Nevertheless, in most cases, the congregation successfully achieved its goal, using legal audits and the right of veto on any publications claiming Catholic status. The documentary epilogue of the congregation's activities in the period under consideration impresses with its scale. In the lists of seized property in the broad sense are hundreds of confiscated book runs, closed chairs in universities in Europe and America, and, most importantly, archives that remain closed to researchers for decades ahead. The fate of these archives is the fate of the memory of resistance within the system. The congregation's influence on the era's legal system was expressed in the tightening of the 1983 Code of Canon Law, where many of Ratzinger's and his team's developments received the status of law. The reform of Canon 751, defining the concepts of heresy, apostasy, and schism, became the result of decades of archaeology of power conducted in the offices of the Holy Office. Thus, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith is not a relic of the Middle Ages, but a modern, high-tech institution of ideological control. It operates not with faith, but with law, not with mysticism, but with regulations. Within its walls, a word becomes a legal fact, and silence a verdict. Studying this institution allows us to see how power transforms methods while preserving its nature. The pursuit of monopoly possession of the truth through a system of prohibitions, filters, and administrative suppression of any alternative. The analysis of protocols and bulls shows us not divine providence, but human will to power, clothed in the form of an impeccable bureaucratic process. Every document, every seal in this archive is a trace of the struggle for control over meanings, a struggle that does not cease today when old methods of the Inquisition acquire new life in the digital age, retaining their ruthless effectiveness. Continuing our detailed analysis of institutional mechanisms, it is necessary to pay attention to the consultations system, which is the backbone of doctrinal control. According to the regulation approved in 1998, the congregation includes not only cardinals, but also so-called consultants, professors of theology and canon law from all over the world. However, their recruitment passes through a multi-stage security filter. Each name is checked for doctrinal purity over decades. This creates a system in which the expert community self-censors, striving to meet the standards set by the prefect. In this context, Joseph Ratzinger acted not only as a judge, but also as the chief editor of a global corporation. The financial reporting of the congregation, although part of the general budget of the Holy See, contains expense items for special missions. Analysis of these flows from 1981 to 2005 indicates significant expenditures related to legal support for excommunication processes and monitoring of foreign press. The logistics of these operations included the use of diplomatic mail, nuncios, for delivering confidential notifications to recipients. This method of information transmission excluded the possibility of interception by local authorities or civilian special services, ensuring the sovereignty of the Vatican in matters of internal discipline. It is interesting to consider the daily life of the congregation's employees. These are people whose workday is strictly regulated by the liturgical calendar, but whose minds are occupied with the analysis of legal collisions. In the halls where issues of heresy are discussed, there is no place for emotional discussions. Protocols indicate a dry, almost mathematical language of discussions. Every statement is checked for conformity to tradition, which is understood as a mass of documents accumulated over 2,000 years. This textual archaeology turns the congregation into a kind of giant library court, where the verdict is issued based on the comparison of letters. A special place in the system is occupied by the section on disciplinary matters. After the reforms of 2001, initiated by Ratzinger, this section received exclusive rights to investigate the most serious crimes against morals and sacraments. This was a significant expansion of jurisdiction, turning the congregation into the central investigative body of the Church. Documentary analysis shows that this decision was driven by the need for centralization of power in conditions where local bishops could not cope with crisis situations. Thus, the congregation de facto became a ministry of justice and internal affairs at the same time. Criticism of sources related to the activities of this section is extremely difficult due to the regime of strictest secrecy. Nevertheless, documents leaking into the public domain, such as the letter De Delictis Gravioribus on more serious crimes, allow reconstructing the algorithm of actions, from receiving initial information to issuing the final decree, which is not subject to appeal. Here we see absolute power, limited only by the will of the pontiff. The concept of cessation of existence in the professional sense is realized here through dimissio, deprivation of office, which for a cleric means a complete loss of social and economic status. The encryption and classification system of information in the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith deserves separate mention. Documents of category A, archival, open, B, for official use, and C, under the secret of the Holy Office, are stored in different sectors of the archive. The order of access to them is strictly hierarchical. Even high-ranking employees of other Vatican departments have no right to enter the congregation's storage facilities without special permission. This isolation of the archives ensures the preservation of institutional memory, which is used to manage the present. The influence of this structure on the legal system extends far beyond the Church's enclosure, shaping standards of confidentiality and disciplinary proceedings that are copied by other closed organizations. Considering the political consequences of the congregation's activities under Ratzinger's leadership, one cannot fail to note its role in consolidating conservative forces in Europe and the US. Through the censorship of liberal publications and support for traditionalist movements, the congregation shaped a certain intellectual landscape in which ideas of social progress were supplanted by categories of dogmatic stability. This was a conscious strategy to preserve the structure in a changing world. Logistical errors, such as the underestimation of the Internet's influence in the early 2000s, led to some documents becoming public knowledge, which triggered a series of reputational crises. However, the apparatus's reaction was lightning fast. The creation of its own information resources and the strengthening of control over the clergy's digital communications. In conclusion of our study, we must recognize that the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith represents a unique example of a long-lived administrative organism. It has survived empires, revolutions, and world wars, each time adapting its toolkit to new challenges. This is not a black legend, but the cold reality of bureaucratic management. The list of seized property, the fate of the archives, and the influence on the legal system. All this testifies that before us is a structure for which the preservation of the system is the highest priority, standing above the interests of individual persons or national states. The modern Inquisition continues its work, without needing torches and racks, for in the modern world, the most effective way of suppression is not deprivation of life, but deprivation of the right to truth, recorded in an impeccably drafted protocol. Continuing along the timeline, we discover that in the period from 1990 to 2005, the congregation under Ratzinger's leadership carried out an unprecedented operation to unify theological education. According to administrative circulars sent to all Catholic universities in the world, every dissertation and every training program had to undergo verification for compliance with the Instruction on the Church's Vocation of the Theologian. This was a large-scale project to create a single intellectual space managed from a single center. The logistics of this process required maintaining a huge staff of reviewers whose names remained secret. In the protocols, they were listed under code numbers, which once again emphasizes the similarity of the structure to an intelligence organization. The recruitment system for these reviewers was based on the principle of negative selection. Preference was given to those to the intelligence organization, professors with a two energy professionals that there were glowing the other's interaction from situation. Because the recruitment system for negative selection, preference was given to those to the intelligence organization. Once again, the recruitment system for those was based on the principle of negative selection. Preference was ensured the predictability of the congregation's decisions. However, as the analysis of the internal audit of the structure conducted in the late 1990s shows, such a strategy led to a decline in the intellectual potential of the organization itself. The report noted that the quality of vota, expert opinions, began to fall, which created risks for the department's authority. To correct the situation, Ratzinger brought in a number of prominent scholars from Germany and Poland who worked as external consultants, not part of the staff, but having access to secret dossiers. Particular interest is aroused by the method by which the congregation addressed issues of the physical suppression of ideas in the digital age. Instead of attempting to block all information, the structure focused on discrediting sources. The publication of notifications, notificatio, served as a signal to the entire Catholic press that the given author was no longer reliable. This led to the automatic termination of the individual's professional activity. Publishers broke contracts, lectures were canceled, financial grants were revoked. This form of economic elimination proved extremely effective in the conditions of a market economy. A critical audit of the congregation's successes and failures shows that its main victory was the preservation of the Church's monolith during a period of turbulence. However, the price for this was a profound stagnation in intra-institutional dialogue. Betrayals, such as the leak of confidential letters from the prefect's personal office, exposed internal contradictions between various factions within the Vatican Curia, which were vying for financial resources and influence over the Pope. These leaks allowed historians to reconstruct the daily life of the conspirators within the system itself. Those cardinals who sought to use the mechanisms of the Inquisition for their own political purposes. The documentary epilogue of our study is supplemented by an analysis of the legal reform of 2022, carried out already under Pope Francis. Although the congregation was renamed once again to the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, its core functions remained unchanged. Analysis of the new statutes shows that the section on disciplinary matters retained all its powers, and the archives continue to be under papal secrecy. This indicates that institutional continuity in matters of controlling doctrinal purity is a fundamental constant of Vatican statehood. The influence of this body on the modern legal system of the Church is confirmed by the fact that the majority of the Vatican's highest officials have passed through the School of Work in the structures of the Holy Office. In concluding this overview, we must state that the archaeology of power leads us to the conclusion. The Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith is an ideal tool for preserving hierarchy through the management of knowledge. It requires no justifications or moralizing. Its legitimacy is based on documentary precision, legal procedure, and a centuries-old tradition of administrative control. Before us is a mechanism created for eternity, functioning with the cold impassivity of a chancellery, for which every person is merely a line in the protocol, and every idea an object for classification or elimination. The historical path of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, traced through the prism of documents, shows how forms changed, but not the essence of control. In the 16th century, the Inquisition struggled with the printing press. In the 20th, with theological modernism. In the 21st, with digital transparency. Each time, the structure found ways to integrate new technologies into its system of suppression. Analysis of financial flows in the early 2000s points to investments in data monitoring systems and the creation of expert groups on cybersecurity. This underscores that the gods Rottweiler and his successors perfectly understood. In the modern world, power belongs to those who control the information filters. Examining the daily life of the employees of the Palace of the Holy Office today, we see the same austere offices where Latin coexists with modern monitors. The logistics of meetings remain unchanged, the same feria quarta, the same encrypted dossiers. This creates a sense of timelessness, which is an important psychological factor of pressure on those who fall under the congregation's investigation. The person understands that they are facing not just an official, but a 1,000-year-old machine that knows no fatigue and is impervious to emotions. The syntax of power expressed in the documents of the congregation is impeccable. There is no room here for ambiguities or mysterious circumstances. Every decision is justified by references to previous acts, creating an unbroken chain of precedents. This makes the system legally invulnerable within the framework of its own legal field. The critique of sources that we have conducted throughout this investigation confirms, before us is the most documented and most secretive organization in human history. Its archives are a graveyard of ideas deemed dangerous to the stability of the system, and at the same time, blueprints according to which the edifice of modern ecclesiastical power is constructed. The influence of the congregation on world politics is often underestimated. However, through control over the intellectual elite of the Catholic world, through the system of education and censorship, this structure shapes the worldview of millions of people, including politicians, businessmen, and public figures. This is soft power, backed by rigid administrative sanctions. The investigation shows that behind theological disputes always lie concrete political and financial interests, and the congregation serves as an instrument for their protection. The final audit allows us to assert the transformation of the Holy Office into the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith was not an act of repentance, but an act of adaptation. In a world where physical elimination has become impossible or politically inexpedient, it has been replaced by administrative and intellectual suppression. God's Rottweiler, Joseph Ratzinger, brought this system to perfection, turning it into an effective tool for managing crises. The fate of this structure in the future will depend on whether it can preserve its hermetic seal in an era of absolute transparency, or whether the Papal secret will finally become an anachronism under the pressure of new informational realities. However, judging by the documents of recent years, the congregation is ready for a new cycle of evolution, continuing to remain a faithful guardian of the boundaries of the permissible, using the archaeology of power as a method of its eternal existence. Thus, we conclude our investigation. It has shown that the history of the congregation is the history of the struggle for a monopoly on the interpretation of reality. In this struggle, documents play the role of weapons and archives of fortresses. And as long as these fortresses stand and protocols are written, the system will continue its work, controlling the purity of doctrine and eliminating any threats to its power with the same methodicalness with which it has done so over the past 5 centuries. Every element of this structure, from the system of oaths to the financial logistics, works toward one goal: preservation of the status quo. The analysis of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith's activities in the era of Ratzinger and after him confirms: power tolerates no vacuum or uncertainty. It fills space with regulations and instructions, turning living thought into an archival document. This is the essence of the archaeology of power: to excavate the layers that prevents in the North planning bureaucratic stratification, in order to see behind them the cold calculation and iron will of institutions claiming ownership of truth in the final instance. The list of seized documents that we could compile based on the results of this investigation would include not only theological treatises, but also the very possibility of free research within the church system. However, in studying the congregation's methods of operation, we ourselves employ its weapons: documentary precision and systemic analysis. This allows us to restore the true picture of events, free from myths and speculations, and to understand how one of the most closed and